Are gamers addicted to fictional women and softcore cuddling? That's what we're going to discuss today. A recent situation has arisen from the game Stellar Blade, which has brought back the age-old argument, are gamers addicted to cuddling photography? You can put those two together. I can't say the word for fear of YouTube demonetizing us, so we're gonna have some fun with it. I'm purposely wearing a shirt with anime women with guns and surrounded by anime statues to prove my point. Or to make me look like a sad neckbeard. Well, it's whatever angle you want to take this video. So let me explain how we've gotten back to the age-old argument and where this is and where my research has brought me this time around. Because today we're going to be discussing sexuality in advertising. You see, in the game Stellar Blade, we have an action-adventure with a woman with what people have deemed to be impossible proportions. This led into the usual argument about women needing to look more realistic within their games. This eventually led us down the rabbit hole of the developer coming out and speaking about the impossible proportions of the woman featured in the game. His first response was the woman actually doesn't have impossible proportions. You see, what they chose to do was a body scan of one of their favorite Korean models. The then follow-up argument, when people also then began to argue about how realistic that is, the developer then followed up by stating, I don't really care anyway, I'm making a video game that I want to be fantasy, so I'm going to make a woman that is a fantasy. And that was kind of where the argument ended, or at least where it typically ends when it comes to sexuality in advertising and sexuality in video games. But because in this day and age everything has to have a political leaning argument, people then decided to spin this up. And they argued that this is what gamers want. They want these beautiful, engaging women, and they don't want all the ugly women in Western video games. So I decided to have a look at the situation for research. But no, seriously, I did it for research, Because I was curious. There was one key phrase that kept getting thrown around that made me go, wait, is that really the argument? You see, as I was looking at these tweets and these Reddit posts, one constant counterpoint kept coming up from the people who were against women looking like this or being portrayed like this in advertising and in video games. And that argument was that gamers are addicted to cuddling photography. I hope you know what I'm trying to say.
So we need to roll back time. Come with me to the Wayback Machine, to the years of 1870s and so forth.
The first product known to be using sexuality within its advertising was actually a Pearl tobacco brand in 1871. They had a lightly draped maiden on the package cover. The tobacco sold very, very well. Duke brand cigarettes then featured provocative scarlets and became the leading cigarette brand by 1890. Woodbury facial coal was almost discontinued until they began to use images of romantic couples and suggested love and intimacy. If you want to go more recent to brands you may have heard of, Calvin Klein used sexually explicit advertising recently and came under fire over it. But one of the more funnier situations is the Pepsi brand company actually created advertising in which they told men to download an app so that they could rate women, and if they rated the women properly based on 24 parameters, they had a chance at getting laid. It's pretty much what it boiled down to. But what I'm getting at is sex in ads is not a new phenomenon. The video game advertising in the 90s was well known for associating cuddling with video games and would do advertising such as a woman handcuffed to a bed. And the advertising implied you forgot her there because you're too busy playing with your Game Boy. Now, in more recent years, we've run into a bit of a problem because people are taking this advertising as objectifying women. When we started having things such as the feminist movements back in the 60s and 70s, certain elements of the world around us were beginning to change. One of those did eventually become advertising. But advertising took one of the longest amounts of time to officially change, to the point where it actually took the COVID pandemic to see a massive shift in advertising. So what happens is this. Let me explain why sex in advertising is so effective and why Benny is currently surrounded by dozens of anime women statues and what I'm doing with that. So the concept behind sexuality in advertising simply comes down to they want you to have an association with it. Regardless what your sexuality is, if you're attracted to an attractive woman, seeing her is going to bring pleasure to your mind. The point of that is a primal urge to go, this woman looks lovely, and that makes me happy to see her. Now, the reason they do advertising with that type of content is because if you see the woman, let's take Pepsi for example, a woman in a bikini holding a Pepsi can, they're actually tricking your brain. Seeing the woman holding the Pepsi can will then make you associate that woman with pleasure. It made me happy to see this advertising. Oh, and Pepsi was in the ad. So now you want to try Pepsi because what you're associating is Pepsi with that good feeling, but they're giving you the good feeling from sexuality and advertising. This seemingly makes sense for men or individuals attracted to women, but what about people who are not attracted to women? Well, the concept behind that really boils down to the exact opposite. So let's say you're a woman who is a little unattractive, but you see an attractive woman holding in a Pepsi. Well, they want you to associate you will look good holding that Pepsi. All of this is subliminal. They don't want you to think about this up front. They want you to be scanning your eyes across the street, see that advertising, and just quickly associate. Because if you look at it too long, you're gonna go, why is that woman in a bikini holding a Pepsi? The amount of times that an ad breaks down when you overanalyze it is very quick and easy. The same advertising principles actually apply to those overly over-the-top goofy ads. So let's take an advertisement like Old Spice, where it makes no sense, at least the old ones. Remember those ones where it'd be like, and now I'm on a horse? Those ones are trying to associate the sexuality because, Old Spice now has this hot woman that was attracted to the smell of Old Spice. But also on zany and kooky and weird, because as you noticed, movies and everything turned quirky into an attractive trait. Advertising is always trying to associate your brain with what brings a pleasurable feeling. It lights up the dopamine in your mind. So that's the bare concepts behind sexuality in marketing. This obviously goes much deeper, and I'll link quite a few articles down below on how this works. But it also does begin to backfire, because eventually you can go too sexual with it. And that's where we run into the arguments of companies not giving a crap if you're offended by the overly sexual advertising. It took almost a boycott of Pepsi for them to remove the app that was being used to link men with women and see if they could score them well. So now you're probably going, okay, mildly fascinating. You've touched briefly on a topic that goes into many, many studies, but how does this associate with Stellar Blade and video games? Well, as I said, there was a major shift in the tonality of sexuality in advertising in 2020. You see, the concept behind the advertising before is they want you to go all deep down into your monkey brain and go, I get Pepsi, I get woman. That's what they want you to think. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to spike your dopamine monkey brain to think that. But when COVID hit, we were all told to avoid people. So you can't really advertise, I get Pepsi, I get woman, when I'm also being told I must avoid people. So advertising shifted in tone, which has actually led to a lot of the arguments today, including Stellar Blade. So advertising moved away from showing sexuality in ads heavily. We had already been kind of drifting away from the concept of sexuality in ads, but it wasn't gone. You would always have one person being like, love your body how it is. And then right next to that advertising, really pretty lady and Pepsi. That's pretty much what you would have. I keep using Pepsi. I think Pepsi shifted away from this back in the early 2000s, but you get the point I'm trying to make here. Advertising actually shifted to what would bring you that pleasurable dopamine rush: couples, accepting yourself. Hence a lot more recent advertising moving in what some would call a woke direction. The reasoning behind that is because we were all beginning to get trained to avoid people. So accept yourself. Be happy with yourself. That's where the advertising began to go to in more traditional advertising. Video games also shifted to go more with this mentality. We started getting away from women wearing the bikini armor, and it started to go more towards just presenting women as strong heroes to be played in a video game. Full body outfits and just having them be like the leader that they should be. A great example of that is how Aloy was handled recently in PlayStation, or how Lara Croft went away from just being triangle boobs to being more of a presentable woman who's going on these adventures and doing things that everyone else can't. This is combined with the fact that as we've gone farther away from old school advertising and feminist movements, it's now becoming more and more normalized that women should have heroes to look up to and that heroes shouldn't be running around in a chainmail bikini 24/7. But it was the COVID pandemic that really pushed things over the edge and turned everything into a political argument. If a woman looks to next door neighbor, certain individuals on the internet now want to argue that that has gone woke and she should be fantastical and beautiful, and that's the only thing that we should see. While the counterpoint is we should all accept who we are and accept our neighbors and accept the world around us instead of this fantasy element. Now, my personal opinion on the entire situation is I prefer my video games to be more fantasy oriented, but I am able to disconnect that fantasy from my reality. Some people can't, which is why there is a push to make our fantasy more like our reality. Because if you have the inability to disconnect from what this fantasy world is, then you expect that fantasy world in your reality. Which brings us back to the Stellar Blade argument. Stellar Blade is being argued because the woman looks too incredible, too fantastic. We shouldn't be allowing this. The counterpoint to that whole thing is every game is to each its own. Some games want to have that fantasy, fantastical element, and I do believe that those games should exist. We shouldn't just get rid of every game and just make them look like the girl next door. On the flip side, we should have some more realistic games coming out. And then the ultimate argument is that there shouldn't even be an argument. Because if you're interested, play the game. If you're not, don't. All the way back when the game Nier Automata came out with a very similar, crazy proportioned woman who was running around in her underwear practically because of how short her dress were, we didn't get this nearly as much. The game came out in 2017, and I was all over the internet at that point. As my main channel is Comic Story, and I pretty much had to live on the internet at that time. And I can tell you, there wasn't as much of an argument about, oh my god, she looks too beautiful. There was, of course, the argument that gamers are addicted to photography of cuddling, but it wasn't nearly as bad as is it now. So we again come to the question, why is Stellar Blade being turned into a political argument about sexuality in video games? It boils down to a massive shift in advertising and acceptance of who you are, and basically that maybe we shouldn't just put the woman in the bikini to sell Pepsi, but maybe we can promote that dopamine rush with a simple situation of a couple enjoying a Pepsi. When your brain has been trained to only view the fantastical as your norm, when we start to see reality, you start to reject it. You don't want reality. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be seeing more reality intermingled with our fantastical elements. Which I said I would answer why my room is filled with all the anime women and everything like that. Because I'm aware of the dopamine rush of seeing things that my brain likes to see. And I'm trying to make my office a happy space for me, and I don't want to hate it. And to end this point and to end this video, I'm gonna quote something stated by Oda, the writer for One Piece, when he was questioned why Nami and the characters had an entire bath scene. Because we all know how fan service works. I see pretty girl, I want to watch show. But when some people asked him about maybe it being a little too explicit, his response was, the whole world was naked once. If seeing a little skin gets you all worked up, you might just need to learn some self-control. A little self-control goes a long way. And not everything needs to be fantastical, and not everything needs to be realistic. We need to have a happy medium and stop making everything a political argument. Come on, it's a game.